They buried a railroad spur under a mountain of concrete on a Monday morning. By the following Tuesday, the president of the Homeowners Association was sitting in the back of a federal vehicle with her hands cuffed behind her back. The funny thing is, none of that was supposed to happen. At least not according to the people who lived in those shiny $500,000 houses surrounding my little property. My name is Ethan Mercer. I'm 48 years old, and until all this happened, I figured my most exciting days were behind me. I lived alone in a small house my grandfather built in 1954 just outside the town of Ashford, Virginia. It wasn't much to look at. The roof rattled during storms, the front porch leaned a little to the left, and the old swing-out front squeaked every time somebody sat down. But it was home. It had history. Every scratch in the floorboards meant something. Every corner carried memories. Behind the house ran a stretch of old railroad track that most people assumed was abandoned. Rust covered the rails. Weeds grew waist-high between the ties. Some of the wooden timbers looked like they'd turned to dust if you stepped on them. To the average person, it looked like junk. To me, it looked like something different. I spent 26 years working railroad maintenance before retiring. One thing that job teaches you is that appearances mean very little. A track can look dead for 20 years and still be legally alive. That's a lesson a lot of people never learn until it costs them money. In 2021, developers broke ground around my property. Within 3 years, an enormous neighborhood called Cedar Ridge Estates rose from farmland and forest. 200 homes, stone entrances, decorative fountains, private tennis courts, perfectly trimmed lawns that looked like somebody measured every blade of grass with a ruler. The kind of place where people drove luxury SUVs to collect mail from a mailbox located 60 feet from their front door. At first, I didn't care. Folks can live however they want. The problem started when they decided they didn't like me. More specifically, they didn't like my house. I heard comments here and there. People slowing their golf carts to stare. Real estate agents pointing toward my property while giving tours. One afternoon, I overheard a woman tell a prospective buyer, "That's the only eyesore left in the area." I laughed when I heard it, mostly because I was standing right there holding a fishing rod while she said it. She turned bright red, but not everyone was embarrassed. The HOA president, a woman named Victoria Langley, seemed to take my existence personally. She couldn't find me because I wasn't part of the association. She couldn't tell me what color to paint my house. She couldn't force me to replace my mailbox or trim my trees. The lack of control bothered her. Every few months, she'd find a new reason to visit. One day it was my shed. Another day it was an old pickup truck parked beside the barn. Then it was the railroad tracks. I still remember that conversation. She stood at my fence wearing expensive sunglasses and carrying a clipboard like she was inspecting a military installation. "Those tracks are dangerous," she said. "Someone could get hurt." I looked at the weeds growing through the rails. "Only if they trip over a squirrel." She didn't laugh. "They should be removed." "Good luck with that." She narrowed her eyes. "The community has plans for that area." I remember thinking that was an odd thing to say. Not threatening exactly. Just strange. Looking back now, maybe that was the first warning. The summer everything exploded started like any other. One Saturday morning, I loaded my cooler into my truck and drove to Lake Harmon for a day of fishing. It was hot, humid, and completely ordinary. The kind of day nobody remembers. Around 6 in the evening, I came home sunburned, tired, and smelling like bait. As soon as I turned into my driveway, I knew something was wrong. There were fresh tire tracks everywhere. Construction equipment marks cut across the grass. Then I saw it. The railroad spur behind my property had disappeared. Not removed. Buried. A massive strip of fresh concrete stretched across the entire corridor. Smooth gray cement baked under the afternoon sun. Steam still rose from parts of it. For a few seconds I honestly just stood there staring. My brain refused to process what my eyes were seeing. Then I noticed a laminated sign attached to my fence. Parking expansion. Authorized Community Improvement Project. I actually laughed. Not because it was funny. Because sometimes when people do something unbelievably stupid, laughter is the only response your body can manage. 15 feet of concrete crossed onto my property line. The rails underneath were completely entombed. 60 tons at least. Maybe more. I walked the length of it in silence. The longer I looked, the calmer I became. That should have worried them. Angry men make mistakes. Calm men start asking questions. That night, I climbed into the attic and pulled down an old metal file cabinet my grandfather had kept for decades. Deeds. Surveys, tax records, easement documents. Most people would have gone online. I went digging through 70 years of paperwork. Around midnight, sitting at my kitchen table beneath a flickering light bulb, I found exactly what I was looking for. And the moment I unfolded that yellow document, I realized the people who poured that concrete had just made the biggest mistake of their lives. That document changed everything. I remember sitting there at my kitchen table, the clock ticking so loudly it sounded like somebody hammering nails into the wall, while I ran my finger across a survey line drawn decades before I was born. The railroad easement wasn't dead. It had never been formally abandoned. There were amendments, transfers, maintenance agreements, and regulatory filings attached to it, some dating back nearly 70 years. Most people would have looked at those papers and seen legal gibberish. I saw something very different. I saw federal jurisdiction. I saw liability. And most importantly, I saw that somebody had just poured tens of thousands of dollars worth of concrete directly on top of infrastructure they didn't legally control. Around 1 in the morning, I made coffee and started making calls. The first one went to a former coworker named Russell Tate. We'd spent years inspecting track corridors together. Russell answered on the third ring, sounding half asleep. "Ethan, if this isn't about somebody dying, it better be good." "Nobody's dead." I paused. "But an HOA might be." 10 minutes later, I sent him photos. 20 minutes after that, he called back. The first thing he said was, "Oh, wow." The second thing he said was, "Those idiots actually did it." The next morning, Sunday, I made another call. This one mattered more. About 6 months earlier, I'd heard rumors that a regional logistics company called Blue River Freight was negotiating with county officials to reactivate rail access for a new industrial park east of town. Most people ignored that kind of news. Railroad guys don't. We pay attention. Infrastructure has a funny way of becoming valuable overnight. By noon, I was speaking directly with Blue River's chief operating officer, a man named Daniel Cross. He sounded skeptical at first. Then I emailed photographs, surveys, and copies of the easement paperwork. 20 minutes later, he called me back with a completely different tone. "Mr. Mercer," he said slowly, "do you realize what you've sent me?" "I think so." There was a long silence. Then he said, "That spur is part of our proposed freight route." I leaned back in my chair. "That's what I figured." Another silence. Then he laughed once. Not because it was funny, more because he couldn't believe it. They paved over it, with enough concrete to build a small bridge. By Monday morning, lawyers were involved. Serious lawyers. The kind who bill by the minute and speak in sentences that sound expensive. Blue River filed emergency motions. Regulatory agencies received reports. Surveyors reviewed maps. Engineers reviewed photographs. Things moved faster than I expected. Much faster. Apparently, when millions of dollars in transportation infrastructure are involved, people return phone calls. Meanwhile, Cedar Ridge Estates had no idea what was coming. Residents were posting cheerful photos online of the new parking expansion. Somebody described it as a great improvement for the community. Another homeowner called it a visionary project. Every time I saw one of those posts, I nearly spit out my coffee laughing. By Tuesday afternoon, the first shockwave hit. County officials suspended review of several pending permits connected to the development. Construction schedules stalled. Inspections were delayed. Closings on multiple homes were suddenly uncertain. People started asking questions. Victoria Langley started making phone calls. On Wednesday, my phone rang. Her name appeared on the screen. I answered. "Hello, Victoria." She skipped the greeting. "What have you done?" I smiled. "Good afternoon to you too. County inspectors are calling us." "Sounds stressful. Did you report us?" "I reported concrete covering a railroad easement." Her voice tightened. "Those tracks were abandoned." "Were they?" Silence. "Then, our attorneys disagree." "Then your attorneys should have read the paperwork before you buried it." For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Finally, she said, "This isn't over." "No," I replied. "I don't think it is." She hung up. The next 48 hours were fascinating. Survey crews appeared. Regulatory representatives arrived. Engineers photographed everything. Residents started noticing unfamiliar vehicles entering the neighborhood. Rumors spread. Some homeowners blamed county bureaucracy. Others blamed developers. Nobody knew the full story yet. Then Thursday evening, I got another call. This time from the developer himself, Richard Hale. Richard had the smooth confidence of a man accustomed to getting his way. He spoke like every conversation was a negotiation he expected to win. "Mr. Mercer," he said, "let's be reasonable." Reasonable sounds nice. You know these tracks haven't been used in years. And this project benefits everyone. Apparently not everyone. His patience cracked slightly. "You're creating unnecessary complications." I couldn't help laughing. "Richard, somebody poured 60 tons of concrete onto property they didn't control. We're prepared to compensate you." There it was. The first hint of panic. Compensate me for what? I asked. The inconvenience. I stared out my kitchen window toward the buried tracks. That's interesting, because right now your inconvenience seems a lot more expensive than mine. He hung up shortly after that. By Friday, the concrete itself began betraying them. Summer temperatures climbed into the upper 90s. Expansion stress created visible cracking across portions of the slab. Several sections buckled. What had looked smooth and perfect days earlier now resembled a giant gray mistake stretching across the corridor. Workers were brought in to assess damage. Additional money disappeared. Residents grew nervous. Then federal investigators arrived. Everything changed after that. People imagine investigations as dramatic scenes with flashing lights and shouting agents. Reality is quieter, more uncomfortable. Two investigators in plain clothes walked door to door asking questions. They requested emails, meeting minutes, planning documents, approval records. Somebody on the HOA board must have realized how serious things had become because internal emails suddenly started disappearing. Unfortunately for them, deleted doesn't always mean gone. Over the weekend, homeowners began demanding answers from Victoria. Some wanted to know why permits were frozen. Others wanted to know why inspectors kept visiting. A few wanted to know whether emergency assessments might be coming. Victoria kept assuring everyone things were under control. But confidence is hard to fake when regulators keep showing up. The following Monday morning, exactly 1 week after the concrete was poured, I woke up to 6 missed calls. Blue River's legal team had completed its preliminary damage assessment. Their estimate exceeded $2 million in potential losses connected to project delays, route disruptions, redesign costs, and contractual impacts. When I heard that number, I nearly dropped my coffee mug. Even I hadn't expected it to be that high. Around noon, another piece of news arrived. Federal prosecutors had officially opened a criminal investigation into the circumstances surrounding the destruction and obstruction of transportation infrastructure connected to the easement corridor. Now things weren't merely expensive. They were dangerous. Victoria still didn't understand that. Neither did Richard. At least not yet. Because later that afternoon, while sitting on my porch swing watching the sunset settle over the fields behind my house, I saw 2 black SUVs roll slowly into Cedar Ridge Estates. I remember thinking that somebody's week was about to get a whole lot worse. And for the first time since this started, I realized the story had grown bigger than a stubborn HOA president trying to erase an old railroad track. This was becoming a collision between arrogance and reality was finally arriving at the front gate. Reality arrived faster than anyone expected. The next morning, I was halfway through my second cup of coffee when my phone started buzzing. First Russell called, then Daniel from Blue River, then a local reporter I'd never spoken to before. Something big had happened overnight. I drove toward Cedar Ridge and found a crowd gathering near the community clubhouse. Homeowners stood in small groups whispering. Golf carts were parked everywhere. Nobody looked relaxed. Then I saw the vehicles. Federal agents, county investigators, attorneys. The whole atmosphere felt different, like the air before a thunderstorm. A few minutes later, Victoria Langley emerged from the clubhouse looking nothing like the woman who used to lecture people about mailbox paint colors and lawn edging. She looked exhausted, pale, angry, scared. Richard Hale wasn't doing much better. For weeks they had treated this entire situation like an annoying dispute they could eventually bully their way through. Now they were discovering that some mistakes don't disappear when you throw money at them. By midday, the news became public. Prosecutors announced charges connected to the deliberate obstruction and destruction of protected transportation infrastructure, along with several additional allegations uncovered during the investigation. As investigators dug through emails and meeting records, they found discussions that should never have existed. Internal messages showed warnings from consultants, questions from engineers, concerns about property boundaries, multiple opportunities to stop the project before concrete was poured. Instead of listening, people chose convenience. That decision became very expensive. I wasn't present for the arrests themselves, but enough witnesses described them that I can practically see the scene. Victoria reportedly argued until the very last moment. Richard demanded phone calls. Lawyers appeared. Cameras appeared. Homeowners stared. The same people who once treated the HOA board like local royalty suddenly wanted distance from them. Funny how quickly loyalty changes when legal trouble arrives. That afternoon, an attorney representing the association finally called me. His voice sounded tired. Not angry anymore. Just tired. "Mr. Mercer," he said, "we need to discuss a resolution." I remember leaning back on my porch swing and listening to cicadas buzz in the trees. I'm listening. What followed was the most polite conversation anyone from Cedar Ridge had ever had with me. Suddenly, there were no threats, no demands, no lectures about community standards, just requests, careful requests. They wanted cooperation. They wanted settlement discussions. Most of all, they wanted the bleeding to stop. By then, Blue River's legal team had leverage that bordered on overwhelming. Project delays continued accumulating. Lawsuits were forming. Insurance carriers were involved. Experts were calculating damages. The numbers grew larger every day. We eventually reached terms. Compensation was paid. Restoration requirements were imposed. Independent engineers were brought in. Surveyors returned. Every section of concrete covering the corridor had to be removed and the affected area restored according to professional specifications. Watching that happen was strangely satisfying. For days, jackhammers echoed across the development from sunrise until evening. Workers broke apart the very project that had caused all the trouble. Dust filled the air. Trucks hauled away debris. Residents listened to the noise from homes they had purchased expecting peace and luxury. More than once I sat in a folding chair near my property line and quietly watched the operation. Not because I enjoyed anyone's suffering. At least not entirely. Mostly because I wanted to see the lesson play out to the end. Actions have consequences. Sometimes those consequences arrive with jackhammers. The financial damage spread quickly. Insurance covered part of the disaster, but not all of it. Emergency assessments followed. Homeowners who had never attended an HOA meeting suddenly became very interested in HOA decisions. Lawsuits appeared. More attorneys arrived. The developer's finances began unraveling under the weight of mounting obligations. Within months, the company entered bankruptcy proceedings. The neighborhood survived, but it never fully recovered its reputation. Meanwhile, something unexpected happened in my own life. Blue River approached me with an offer regarding the easement corridor. Negotiations moved surprisingly fast. By the end of the process, I accepted a deal worth more money than I ever imagined that old stretch of track could generate. One day it was an overgrown railroad spur everyone ignored. The next it became the reason I could finally retire exactly the way I wanted. 6 months later, I found myself sitting on the deck of a lake house hundreds of miles away. No HOA. No committee meetings. No letters about landscaping. No arguments over property appearances. Just water, fishing poles, quiet mornings, and enough space to hear myself think. Every now and then somebody asks whether I feel bad about what happened to Victoria and Richard. The honest answer is complicated. I don't celebrate seeing people lose everything. I don't enjoy watching lives fall apart. But I also believe adults are responsible for their choices. They weren't victims of bad luck. They weren't victims of misunderstanding. They were given opportunities to stop. Opportunities to ask questions. Opportunities to respect boundaries. Instead, they convinced themselves that power meant permission. That's a mistake people make more often than you think. The world is full of individuals who assume nobody will challenge them, nobody will notice, and nobody will push back. Then one day they run into a person who knows something they don't. In this case, it happened to be an old railroad supervisor living in a weathered house at the edge of town. Sometimes I think about my grandfather. He kept those records for decades. Most people would have thrown them away. Had he done that, the outcome might have been very different. Funny how history works. A stack of dusty papers sitting in a forgotten file cabinet ended up changing the future of an entire neighborhood. And maybe that's the lesson buried underneath all of this. Not every old thing is worthless. Not every quiet person is powerless. And not every piece of land is as simple as it looks from the road. So now I want to hear from you. Do you think the HOA leaders got exactly what they deserved? Or do you think the punishment went too far? If you were in my position, would you have settled? Or would you have taken the fight all the way through court? Let me know in the comments because stories like this always seem to split people right down the middle. And if you've ever dealt with an HOA, a property dispute, or someone who thought they could ignore the rules because they had power, share your story below. I'd love to read it. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications for more stories where ordinary people find themselves in extraordinary conflicts and sometimes come out on top.